a treat to be in a room full of people who do something real. I had a buddy who, if you cover politics and government, that's kind of foreign territory to you. I had a buddy who worked in the FBI, and he referred to what everybody on the stage does, including myself especially, as selling air. And so I got to visit with a number of your members earlier, got to look at some of the cool award-winning projects up there, coming up to the Academy Awards of Engineers tonight. So from the 2nd Avenue subway to causeways to pump stations to a world tower, it was really cool to see the amazing things that are being done in this room. And a theme of all those projects is their investment in America, they're expanding America, they're renewing America. And so that was refreshing. As we kick this off, there's one member of our panel who has spent a childhood on job sites, who knows the difference between cement and concrete. Congresswoman Esty, tell us about your early experience with dirt under your nails.
Well, good morning. Great to be with you here today. So my father and grandfather were both civil engineers. So yes, let's give it up for civil engineers. So I grew up in a household with blueprints, slide rules, which is pretty terrifying, pocket protectors, mechanical pencils, and hard hats. So one of my earliest memories as a kid, we moved around. My dad was doing heavy construction. And for a time we lived in Northern California. And as a kid, when we'd make the big trek to San Francisco and drive across the spectacular Golden Gate Bridge, which is truly one of the man-made wonders of the world, I noticed that every time we drove over, they were painting the bridge. Every single time. And that finally struck me, like, Dad, why are they always painting the bridge? And he said, you know, Elizabeth, and he was also a Navy man, so he really knew his way around corrosion. He said, you know, you build something really important and big, and then you need to take care of it. And so they have to keep painting it to maintain that bridge. And I think that's really a lesson for us, what we need to be doing in America. Build it right, build it big, and maintain it well. And that's what we haven't been doing, and what the 4 of us are really committed to ensuring that Congress gets back to the business of doing.
Congressman Blumenauer, I can't not ask you about your pin. So A, tell us about your trademark here, and B, tell us what kind of feature that you think that bikes have in the mix of solutions that are doable and probable.
The bike pin is a symbol of the most efficient form of urban transportation ever designed. But for me, it's a metaphor. The cycling is an effort where we're able to make a difference for people with relatively modest investments. Frankly, that's what we should be doing across the board. We're not stepping up. We need fewer studies and more action. I've introduced the first gas tax increase in 23 years. The reason I left the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and went to Ways and Means is to be able to finance infrastructure, whether it's water, surface, rail, and we've failed. No disrespect to my Republican friends, but since they took charge, we have had 380 hearings on the Ways and Means Committee, and we've had 1 5-minute witness on providing the revenues. Thousands of witnesses. We've had 1 5-minute witness in 7 years and 4 months. For me, being able to deal with things like cycling, mass transit, people know what to do. People around the country are not waiting for Congress, but they need Congress to do its part on national infrastructure. And I would hope, my takeaway, is that you ask Congress to give you 2 weeks of hearings. You'd have Trumpka from the AFL-CIO, Donahue from the Chamber, you would have the Trucking Association, the array of people who would be there making the case that you've made on Capitol Hill as long as I've been here and punctuated with your reports. And if they'd give us 2 weeks of a real, live, robust hearings, I think it would be easier for Congress to do what over half the states have done.
Congressman Woodall, you talk about 21st century. You talk about 21st century solutions on transportation and infrastructure. What's a 21st century solution that we can afford?
Well, you've got to make sure you're getting a dollar's worth of value out of a dollar's worth of taxes. To Earl's point, it's absolutely true that at a federal level, you've not seen a big drive to craft revenue. And candidly, I don't have the support of my constituency back home. We were all Democrats in Georgia 30 years ago. Now we're all Republicans in Georgia today. But even representing one of the most conservative counties and one of the most conservative states in the country, while they rejected a gas tax increase at the federal level, rejected a gas tax increase at the state level, they put forward as a county the largest bonding initiative in the state's history in order to expand a local roadway that was important to those folks. They thought they were going to get a dollar's worth of value from their local community in ways they can't get it from Washington, D.C. 21st century solutions start with looking at the I-85 rebuild that we put together down in the great state of Georgia. Right, amazing public works project, $16.3 billion at the $1 million at the end of that project. We gave almost a 25% bonus to C.W. Matthews for completing that project on time and under budget. Do you know how many Tea Party conservatives I heard complain about the government spending 25% extra on that public works project? Zero.
Touché.
Folks are willing to pay when they think they're getting value, and that's what we have in this instant communication world that we live in today. I have a better opportunity than ever to explain value to voters, but voters have a better opportunity than ever to understand whether they're really getting that value or not.
And what to them is the tipping point? What is to them is something that's clearly of value? Or how do you explain it best?
I don't just want orange cones going up. I want orange cones coming down. And that is a change that we're seeing in transportation policy in Georgia. And more importantly, I don't want those dollars going, to Earl's point, to another study. I want those dollars going to pavement. I want those dollars going to steel. I want those dollars going to being transformative into answering the question of, can I get to my kid's soccer game on time or not? We're doing that in Georgia at a local level in ways that the feds can't do it. We contribute at the federal level a relatively small portion, as you know, of infrastructure funding. The burdens of getting hooked up with the feds are high. I was talking to a Democratic colleague of mine the other day, and she said, Rob, we're never, ever going to build a big public works project like the Hoover Dam again in this country because you Republicans refuse to fund it. And I said, no, we're never going to build another big public works project like that in this country because the regulations refuse to allow it. Now, if my friends on the left are frustrated that there's not enough money and my friends on the right are frustrated that the process is too long and cumbersome, that seems to me to offer a great opportunity for coming together.
This seems like something for the Problem Solvers Caucus. Congressman Faso, we're lucky to have with us two members of the working group on infrastructure from the Problem Solvers Caucus. Congressman Faso, first, tell us what the Problem Solvers Caucus is, and second, tell us your biggest idea, your most promising idea from your recent report, Rebuilding America's Infrastructure.
Well, the Problem Solvers Caucus, and thank all of you for being here today, and thanks for inviting us and my colleagues, is about 50 members of the House. You can only join if you bring another member from the opposite party in with you. And so we will periodically, we routinely get together, 25 Democrats, 25 Republicans, to discuss issues, whether it's healthcare, whether it's transportation, a whole range of issues where we clearly, immigration, where Congress has clearly not been able to achieve a consensus, and we actually have provided reports and ideas on how we can achieve a consensus on a bipartisan way to solve problems. Elizabeth, in fact, with my colleague John Katko from Syracuse, co-chaired an infrastructure report which we issued a few months ago, and it had a number of suggestions on where we can go. It did not explicitly say, for instance, where the revenue comes from, but I think very clearly, I agree with everything my colleagues have said here this morning. I think the fundamental issue for much of my constituency, which is a rural area, Hudson Valley and Catskills, central New York, in New York State, everyone drives. And if you just simply say we're going to raise the gas tax 15 cents, there will be a lot of distrust that the money actually will go for dealing with the infrastructure issues. So it requires all of us, from the president, from the industry, from the Congress, to be able to explain to the public what truly the need is, where the gap is, how 18 cents a gallon, for instance, 25 years ago, the mileage fuel efficiency has improved by 40% since then, but that means that we have a substantial reduction in the revenue coming in. In my state of New York, 18 cents is the federal, about 50 cents are the levies that New York State puts on in various ways, shape, or form. And many people among the public are distrustful that government, because New York State has routinely diverted some of those resources or used it in a way that, frankly, is fiscally irresponsible with more debt and more borrowing. Many people are skeptical that the money actually will go for the purposes that we're telling them it will go for. So I think it's really incumbent upon us to do that. And we also need to think of other ways, because those electric vehicles, for instance, they're not paying that fuel tax. So that's not fair. So perhaps we need to consider a levy in substitution for the gas tax at a different level of the producer in order to generate the revenue that we need so that everyone has skin in the game.
Congresswoman Esty, you are the co-chair of the Infrastructure Working Group, and you lit up when Congressman Faso made the point about electric vehicles.
Yeah, so we're going to clearly have to modernize how we pay for the Highway Trust Fund. As John mentioned, the purchasing power loss is 40%. So part of the reason we are in such a deep hole is simply between having the CAFE standards, so you have more efficient vehicles, electric vehicles, natural gas vehicles. Those are good things. But the net result is Congress didn't index the gas tax at the time. So one of the things we call for is looking at new innovative ways that we need to transition to. Vehicle miles traveled is one of those ideas, which the state of Oregon is actually test driving that right now. Different ways to deal with privacy concerns, which are real for people, but we are going to need to do something. Our colleague from Kentucky drives his Tesla every day and plugs it in. He's paying zero. He's paying nothing. So there are proposals, everything from carbon taxes that would fund things generally, to barrel taxes, to things like vehicle miles traveled. But we are going to have to transition. And an important part of what the Problem Solvers Group did is to make the point it isn't just about financing. If it were, Wall Street's got plenty of money sitting on the sidelines. We need to have real funding. And Congress has a role in doing that. So we do need to get together, and that is something that our group said, listen, it could be a freight tax. In fact, the truckers are so angry about this that they're calling to tax themselves. You know it's gotten bad when people call tax us, right? It's usually tax the guy behind the tree. At this point, the truckers are so upset about broken axles, late appointments. I know in my home state of Connecticut, if you want to look up one of the worst traffic intersections in the world, rated in the top 10 of worst, look the Mixmaster at 84, I-84, and Route 8 in Waterbury, Connecticut, and you will know what I mean. And the person who delivers water for the region says his guys spend an hour a day stuck, burning fuel, trying to get back and forth across 84. So there's huge lost productivity and a huge gain if we get it right. We have the same issue in Connecticut too, though. There haven't been lockboxes on the transportation. So revenues, and that has eroded public trust. Bob is absolutely right, it's eroded public trust, and that's something that we really do need to make sure these funds are dedicated. And the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, for example, any of you who deal with projects at ports, almost half that money has gotten siphoned off and spent elsewhere. So Congress really has an obligation to serve the American people by collecting appropriate revenue, having streamlining that will help ensure more of those funds get in. And the last thing I want to make a point about is having consistent funding. You cannot do projects efficiently if you don't know if you're going to have the funding. And I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding, right? It's really frustrating if you're a project engineer and suddenly, like, I don't know if I'm going to have the money. And this has happened over and over and over again in our states. And so projects take a long time, they cost more money, they end up costing 50% more, the public is disgusted, and we are not doing anybody favors by that. So streamlining of projects, sustained funding, appropriate funding, and don't rate it. And those are simple, sound simple, they're straightforward, they would be transformative, frankly, right now. And that's the opportunity we have, and that's what we need to be doing in Congress, is ensuring those things.
Congressman Blumenauer, what are some of those interesting programs and experiments in Oregon that the Congresswoman was referring to? My family's in Wilsonville, about half an hour from PDX. What's going on in Oregon that we might want to pay attention to in other states?
Well, for the last 11 years, Oregon has been experimenting with the vehicle mile traveled fee. It's actually not just Oregon anymore. We were able to put in the last reauthorization extending that concept to other states, and there are a dozen states that are doing it. The simple fact is that we cannot continue financing surface transportation based on gallons of fuel consumed. We don't have to. We've demonstrated that. We're allowing people, the privacy issue can be dealt with by allowing people to determine what mechanism they want to keep track of how far they go, not where they go, how far they go. And those experiments are moving forward. We're looking at autonomous vehicles that are all going to be electric. In the foreseeable future, we're going to watch the bottom fall out of the transportation funding paradigm. Fewer gallons of fuel consumed. There's also a little matter of parking fees, which are going to be reduced dramatically. Autonomous vehicles are going to use a fraction of the parking that we have now. Traffic fines, you're not going to have autonomous vehicles running red lights the way that we do now. So that is going to have to move to a use-based system. What I have been arguing for the last 4 or 5 years, raise the gas tax, index the gas tax, replace the gas tax with something that is sustainable, like a vehicle mile traveled fee. And we have, I pay for my road use in Oregon now using that system. We're not very far away. We're in a system now where cars are just great big computers with wheels. This transition can take place much faster than people think. It could happen with the trucking industry that is losing money because of poor maintenance and congestion. They could flip the switch in a matter of months to make this transition. What we need to do is get serious about doing it. You know what to do. You've been able to help on the state level, people step up, take action, and have the funding. But you know you need a federal partnership for projects that are multi-state, multimodal, and long-term. And we just need to do it. This is insane.
Congressman Woodall, what are the chances of selling a gas tax increase to your constituents, and how would one do it?
Well, I think the chances are pretty good in my part of the world. Folks believe in a user fee. If you use it, you ought to pay for it. If you don't mind sitting in traffic, then keep things just the way they are. If you want to get to that soccer game a little bit faster, chip in and make that happen. We have 2 of the top 5 freight congested intersections in the country, in my backyard. But to Earl's point about how you know how to get it done and things you have done, the paradigm is different today than it would have been 20 years ago. When Chairman Bud Schuster was leading the House Transportation Committee, Georgia was arguing about whether we were going to get back 89 cents on the dollar, 79 cents on the dollar, 92 cents on the dollar. Over the past 20 years, folks have come to their members of Congress and said, we want you to keep funding the Transportation Trust Fund, whether you come up with a mechanism for funding it or not. And so today, every single state in the nation is getting back more than $1 for the dollar that they send in in transportation taxes. So who do you think wants to come sit at the table with me and have this conversation about how we reform the system? If you were getting back 89 cents yesterday, you want to come sit down with me because maybe you'll get back 91 cents tomorrow. But if you're getting back $1.10 today, as every state in the nation is, who wants to come sit down with me and talk about how they can only get $1 back tomorrow? We have all been complicit in the something for nothing paradigm that exists in the Transportation Trust Fund today. It's always hard to raise a user fee. It's made all the harder when you've perpetuated the myth that something for nothing is an option.
Congressman Faso, in the report that the Infrastructure Working Group you point out that by some estimates, the funding gap may be as high as $2 trillion by 2025 across all sectors of American infrastructure. Like, what does that mean, and how does that change if you're a Republican? How do you want that to change?
Well, I think the funding gap is real. The fact is that we can't just look at transportation, though, in isolation from the overall financial issues that the federal government and all of us as American citizens face. We just passed the Omnibus Appropriation bill. I voted for it a few weeks ago. The House had passed all 12 appropriation bills by October 1 last year. The Senate didn't pass any. We wound up in these continuing resolutions. So we came up with a funding legislation and added on with the tax bill that was enacted last year. If you look at the projected budget deficits that we're facing as an entire nation, it is truly alarming. We're looking at trillion-dollar deficits going forward. And that funding bill we passed represented 28 to 30% of all federal spending. 70% of federal spending is on automatic pilot. It's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt. And so one of the compelling reasons why we have to come up with a better user fee or funding mechanism, whether it's what Earl is talking about or what Elizabeth and Doug are talking about, is because we've got to realize that the user fee is the fairest way to pay for these transportation programs. And if we don't find a reasonable way to pay for these programs, these issues are going to be subsumed in the larger financial train wreck that is the federal budget. And if interest rates go up 1%, that's an extra $200 billion a year in interest on the debt. And so these looming issues are ones that I know your focus is on the infrastructure side, and it should be. But all of us as American citizens, and certainly those of us in Congress, need to be focused on the totality of the problem. And so that's why I think finding a revenue source, whether it's at the producer level, whether it's a new user fee for highway users generally, but getting a revenue source which attacks those that are not now paying is going to be the only way we're going to ensure that we have the revenue to deal with this. Because if you look at this in the context of trillion-dollar annual federal budget deficits, there isn't a new revenue, or there's not a ability to provide more resources, even though we all know we need to do it, unless we come up with a funding mechanism, a user fee that is fair and can be explained to the public to fund transportation and infrastructure, water, sewer, roads, bridges, airports, etc.
Congresswoman Esty, and then I'm going to have a jump ball question for the group. I loved the description of cars as computers on wheels. As the Problem Solvers Caucus delved into infrastructure, what were some of the technological fixes that you found, or what were some of the exciting future sort of blow my mind things that you learned about during that process?
Well, I mean, some you're looking at. Actually, I've got a committee hearing today on new technologies and new materials. So some of you are using new materials. And so if you look at things like permeable asphalt and the difference that will make to deal with climate change, looking at improved building codes, things that we can do to use new technology and new materials to build things better, lighter, stronger. And so those are exciting, and that's part of what I've got actually both on the Transportation Committee as well as on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, trying to marry that innovation of America. One of the things we looked at, which is I think really important, is not just infrastructure, but infrastructure. You need to have a cyber-secure, reliable grid, and you need to have internet everywhere for Americans to compete. So in the way that the TVA transformed parts of America by electrifying the rural South, and in the way the interstate highway system transformed America by connecting us by cars, we are now connected by bits, right? By bits of information. And so part of the point we made on our committee with our working group is that we need to have infrastructure as part of infrastructure, because all Americans need to do that to be able to compete in the 21st century. So that has to be part of the package. It can't just be what we see, it's how we connect through the net and through the grid. So I urge people to remember those pieces, because those are transformative for the 21st century economy as well. And you folks are involved in that too. So I make sure that we include that as part of the funding. One thing I want to say that I think we do need to look at, I think was a missed opportunity, and that was on tax reform. A lot of us, I'd have to say on the Democratic side in particular, would have liked to have seen repatriation of overseas money, some of that money go into an infrastructure bank to help fund. And I can say with a different hat, not my problem solvers hat, but with the New Democrats hat, which is sort of a pro-growth Democrat group, which is now the largest caucus in the Democratic caucus, are the New Democrats, who believe we have to have a vibrant economy and economic growth. We're calling for an infrastructure bank and actually readjusting the corporate, among other things, the corporate tax rate, tweak it up a little bit because it went so low, it was lower even than the corporations had asked for, and set some of that money aside to fund an infrastructure bank. We shouldn't be going into debt for pieces of paper. You do go into debt to buy your house and to build your bridges and roads. And so we have it completely the reverse in Congress. We have no capital budget. We borrow for the wrong things. And I can tell you the pension funds and the mom and pop stores in my district believe in investing in infrastructure, and they know it has long-term benefits. They really resent the fact that we're going into debt for pieces of paper. They understand that that's the right kind of long-term investment. So we have got to flip that paradigm, and hopefully you can help make that point to your members of Congress today.
So a jump ball question for any of our members of Congress. As I talked to the executives and the leadership of this organization, like, they were very solution oriented. They were very interested in what's possible. And we hear so much about Washington being broken, Congress being done for the year. For anyone, what is still possible this year? And I'm talking purely in a clinical sense.
Hey, well, I have a great deal of optimism, so I'll take that spot. Earl left us on the Transportation Committee to go to the Ways and Means Committee. I don't know what the Ways and Means Committee is going to get done, and if you watch those hearings, they are a little more partisan. But tune in to a transportation hearing. Tune into a transportation markup. We're going to mark up the FAA bill next week. The contentious part of the FAA was the cooperatization of air traffic control. We've dropped that out of the bill. We're going to have a very bipartisan markup next week. We're going to move an FAA reauthorization bill to the floor. Next month, we're going to take up WRDA. We've made a point of trying to get WRDA back on a schedule every 2 years, once a Congress. We're going to get that done. We succeeded 4 years ago. We succeeded 2 years ago. We're going to mark that up in May. It's going to be a very bipartisan markup. We spent more money on Army Corps of Engineer flood control projects in the emergency appropriations bill than we did in the last 10 years of appropriations budgets combined. Are there still problems there? Of course there are, but we're going to get that done. And then I'll tell you that middle of the summer, we're going to mark up an infrastructure package in a surface transportation sense. I know the Senate is going to tell you today they don't see the bandwidth to get that done, but we can either sit idly by, or we can try to set an example that others can follow. And you'll see yet a third bipartisan markup and bill come out. So at least from an infrastructure perspective, the art of the possible is alive and well in 2018.
I think Rob is right. We can get some things done. Obviously, it's a political season now, and every day we get closer to November, it becomes more difficult. But I think that the opportunity is there, and I've also offered a kind of a variant of the infrastructure bank that would encourage sovereign wealth funds and pension funds to be able to invest in infrastructure projects. The administration's proposal, the $200 billion as an incentive for a privatization, A lot of places in the country that would work fine, as many other places it wouldn't. But obviously there hasn't been a lot of movement in that regard. But I'm still hopeful that we can encourage more public-private partnerships, get sovereign wealth funds and pension funds and others investing in infrastructure projects where there would be a return, and that the governments would be able to harvest, unlock some of the value in some of those projects, and use that for additional infrastructure, as you saw Australia and others do around the world. So there's a possibility, I think, that we can still do that.
You need to cut to the chase. An infrastructure bank is great. I'm an all-of-the-above sort of guy. Public-private partnerships. I've got 10 pieces of legislation that provides infrastructure funding. Reinstitute the Superfund tax, for heaven's sakes. It expired 21 years ago. We've got a Superfund. We don't have a Superfund tax to be able to do something with it. What we need to do is step up and put the money on the table. Bill Schuster is now supporting my gas tax increase, as is Peter DeFazio. President Trump has twice opened up the possibility of raising the gas tax. The Trucking Association that was mentioned, Chris Spears made eloquent testimony before the T&I committee. I mean, put this in place. When we introduced it, you were part of the broadest coalition for any controversial issue before Congress. You're part of that. What we have to do is bring all these cats and dogs that are out there and saying gas tax here, 25 cents there, and put it to the test. Have 2 weeks of hearings about what's possible. Why was it that in South Carolina, Republican legislators overrode the veto of their governor and raised the gas tax? Why are all these red states increasing the gas tax? It's because people know you've got to put money on the table and move forward. You put out these reports on an annual basis, or not annual basis, I get every 4 years, but it's kind of painful every year to look at it. You know that if we put the money for the Corps of Engineers, for the harbors and bridges, for the infrastructure, for our electrical system, these things are possible. But what's happened is you have people sit around talking about the problems, or, you know, we do this on the margins. And that creates more problems because we cut corners and we can't deliver on what people want, and we have more excuses to not follow through. We've had people with the FTA making it a fine art to be able to parse what we can't fund. If we had the money in the trust fund, bear in mind that was a Ronald Reagan creation in 1982. And anybody who thinks we can't raise the gas tax ought to dust off Ronald Reagan's speech on Thanksgiving Day in 1982, where he called the Congress to come back and raise the gas tax a nickel a gallon when that was real money, and it passed on a bipartisan basis. Let's put it to the test.
I'm going to follow up with where Earl was. I think if the president leaned in, this could happen. And a bunch of us told him that. I actually told his staff that. Because I will say that right now, Republican leadership has been opposed in Congress. The public is not opposed if they know it's going to go to things that matter. But I think there has been, and I have to say, a former classmate of mine, Grover Norquist, who I'll be seeing this week, has been responsible in part for getting a lot of my colleagues to sign a no taxes pledge under any circumstances. We should be taxing for the right things and spending in the right ways. And there needs to be accountability, absolutely. But you just can't right now, when we look at this gap of $2 trillion, it can't be done by financing. It's got to be done by funding. It's not sleight of hand. It actually needs to be real dollars. And you know that. You can't just, get an IOU that in 10 years maybe the money will be there. The bridges and stuff need to be built right now. So I do think that the White House is in a position, I think if the dynamic is going to change on funding, and Earl's right, we've had how many hearings? We had a hearing in T&I just a month or so ago in which every single person at the table of every political stripe of every single industry, all were begging us to do something to fund the trust fund. However, T&I, Transportation Infrastructure, has zero authority. That's Ways and Means. That's where this has to get done. And so we can all day long say we think this is a great idea. But it's the money guys in Ways and Means who are going to have to make that decision. And I don't think that moves unless the president leans in. Now, I will say we did get, for example, the Brownfields bill reauthorized in this Congress. We did it out of 2 committees, and it got done in the budget bill. That hasn't been reauthorized since 2006. Now, you will not read that in any headlines, but we fought hard for that bill. It's got $100 million more than it had last year because of what we did. Much better policy, and there are still things getting done. So no, in the back of the room and in committees you're not reading about, we are still getting things done, but there needs to be more of that. And we have to get away from this zero-sum idea that for the red team to win, the blue team has to lose. Because right now America's losing with that kind of thinking. And I think individually we are all committed to
and vice
versa. That like one team has to win for the other one. You have to know the other side's lost for you to win. And that just, we got to be on Team America about this. And that's the imperative we have right now.
Congressman Blumenauer, you talk about Ways and Means Committee doing its job. What do you mean by that?
Just what I said. We've had one 5-minute witness in over 380 hearings. Paul Ryan wouldn't give us. Dave Camp gave us that one hearing. And by the way, it was the former Republican governor of Kansas who raised the gas tax twice, Bill Graves, who talked about raising the gas tax twice in a conservative state like Kansas and living to tell the tale. In fact, some of our friends in the infrastructure space have done research that shows that those legislators that went out on a limb and raised the gas tax got reelected at a higher rate than the people who voted against it. Give us 2 weeks of hearings, replicate what happened on T&I, and let the wide range of people come in and make their case, because I think there are enough people on the Ways and Means Committee. I think it would be embarrassing to have the chamber, labor, engineers, bicyclists, contractors, all come in and say the same thing and then sit back and pretend that we're not going to let that happen. We can capitalize, we can bond against this, we can have a shot in the arm to be able to make this happen across the country, and every state, every congressional district will be better off. But the time to do it is now. And you've got the report that explains why that's the case to do it.
Congresswoman Esty, say that Speaker Pelosi gets the gavel back. Even Republicans these days will tell you that that's more likely than not. How much will change, and what will be the impediments even if Democrats have the gavel?
Well, as they joke, the enemy is always the Senate, so there is that problem. But actually, divided government historically, I will say, has been an opportunity to do things like infrastructure. And, I mean, you said you're an optimist. I'm an optimist. You have to be, or you wouldn't want to be doing this job. But truly, I think because the public so much needs and wants this, the average person on the street totally gets that this is a core function of government. They do wonder about a lot of things that are done by the federal government. They do not wonder about the fact that the interstate highway system and making sure our airports are safe, they understand that's a core function of government, and they'd be supportive of that. So I think, I hear all the time that's one of the top issues businesses come to me about, is the transportation system. So I think there is real possibility, I do. Divided government works sometimes for things like this.
I hope Democrats learn from their failures. I mean, I supported President Obama. He got the worst job imaginable, the economy in free fall. But one of the things that I was bitterly disappointed is that he resisted raising the gas tax because he made a promise that he didn't want taxes raised on anybody who made under $250,000 a year. It wasn't until the final stages of the administration that they came forward and were optimistic about that. That was a mistake. We should have done it then. I personally disagreed and raised that repeatedly with Obama. I hope Democrats learn from that mistake and move forward with dispatch if we are entrusted with the responsibility to run the House of Representatives next Congress.
Yeah, I might disagree that it's more likely than not that Nancy's going to have the gavel come next spring. But note in this conversation, there's a bit of an absence of a value proposition. Let's have more revenue. Well, that's the easy go-to for a revenue-raising body. The Constitution gives us that responsibility. But to sell it back home, it's got to be a value proposition. The same Republican voters at home who tell me no to a gas tax in Washington said yes to $1 billion annually in the state of Georgia because they're getting more value out of that Georgia dollar than they are out of the federal dollar. Same thing at the county level. And so that's my concern. I want to get it done this year in a Republican-led Congress because I want to pair the value proposition with the revenue-raising proposition. Raising the revenue is a challenge no matter when you do it. It's having that balanced approach that I think gives us the best opportunity to win support across red and blue areas.
Congressman Woodall, where you started was interesting. Pushback. What is the case for Republicans keeping the House?
Well, take a look at the regulatory environment that you all work in. If you believe that the taxpayer is getting less value out of their infrastructure dollar today than they were 7 years ago, then you ought to run out the folks who want to reform the regulatory environment. You know, the pendulum swings back and forth. You saw it on, thinking about financing, you saw it on Dodd-Frank, right? Wall Street was in free fall. The American financing system was threatened. We passed the Dodd-Frank financial reform bill. Now we have more than 36 bipartisan bills that are getting supermajorities of Democrats or Republicans, veto-proof majorities, saying, hey, we went a little too far in that area. Our community banks are being hurt. Our local credit unions are being hurt. Let's swing that pendulum back. That pendulum's always swinging left and right. To Elizabeth's point, there's a lot getting done behind the scenes, and it's not newsworthy. Whether it's the Perkins Act that the House passed or the Brownsfield bill, you go right on down the list of good common sense legislation. That's not what we're talking about. You folks are in the good common sense business. If we can crack this infrastructure nut, which we said we were going to do, which we want to do, which Chairman Bill Schuster is committed to doing, I think paired with all of our other successes, our collaborative bipartisan successes, we're going to make the case for leadership.
While we're on the pendulum, Congressman Faso, you represent a fascinating microcosm of some of the big trends in American politics. You represent the Hudson Valley, the Catskills. President Obama won your district twice. Last time by 6 points. Then President Trump won your district by 6 points, a 12-point swing. Tell us what that tells us about what's going on in America.
Well, and it's very interesting. President Obama carried it twice, as you mentioned. President Trump won it by 6. In our district, Bernie Sanders got 61% of the vote in the Democratic presidential primary against Hillary Clinton. And I've always said that the Trump and the Sanders phenomenon in 2016 were flip sides of the same coin. They were reflecting economic distress. And they may have had different ways of solving that distress or dealing with it, but they were both at its core a sense that Washington's not working, something has to be done, the paradigm has to be changed. And I think that still exists in large part. So it's a volatile political environment. I think that, yes, we will likely lose some seats in the House this year. But the question is, do we lose the majority? I think a lot of my friends on the other side are counting their votes before they're cast. And 7 months is a long time between now and Election Day. Fundamentally, most people are seeing the economy improving, and that should be good for the party in power. But we know historically the out party picks up seats, an average of 25 or so seats in the first by-election after a president is elected. And this is a very unusual presidency. Let's be clear about that. We've never really seen anything like this. So it's a very unpredictable, volatile political environment. So candidates like like me in a race like mine in a swing seat, we're really focused on delivering stuff locally, on working and being involved in local issues throughout the district. And the other side will try to nationalize the race, and I localize the race. So that's really the approach that I take. But I think that it's very difficult to persuade a lot of those folks in my district, and I ask people all the time, well, how about a 10-cent a gallon gas tax increase? Oh, no. Because they just don't have the knowledge of what the financing is, and there's a lot of distrust in where the revenue would go. I think ultimately, if it was properly explained, and I think Elizabeth is right, if the president came out and said, here's what the swamp has done, and they haven't told you the truth about the financing, and here's where the Highway Trust Fund is, and here's what we need to do to fund projects like all of us would support, I think that would help, certainly among more conservative voters, to see the need for additional revenue.
Congressman Woodall, picking up on Congressman Faso's point about economic distress. Today's tax day was a little delayed, and President Trump has an op-ed in USA today talking about the economy roaring back. But the roots of a lot of that economic distress, including mechanization, hasn't changed and arguably has gotten worse. What does that tell us for 2020, or of the direction of these voters who were and probably are still economically distressed?
Well, undeniably, there are folks seeing pay raises across the country. There are folks seeing bonuses across the country. In my home district, whether you're talking about Home Depot or UPS, go right on down that list. Not only is there a help wanted sign in every facility, there are wages going up. But whether career and technical education, bipartisan issue folks want to work on together, retraining employees to compete in the 21st century marketplace, bipartisan issue that folks want to work on together. I think we have seen a collective sigh of relief back home that the other shoe's not about to drop. That finally there's not going to be a new job-killing regulation that comes out tomorrow, or a competitiveness ending tax increase that comes out tomorrow. And again, that's all been done in a collaborative way. We saw in 1998, in the midst of the Clinton economic boom, the Newt Gingrich economic boom, the party in power lost, the House Republicans leading the show, expected to gain seats, lost seats because of that collective sigh of relief. Folks didn't care about the president's problems. Folks didn't care about international affairs. Folks cared about their own personal economic situation. And I am feeling that, at least in the southeastern United States, rising dramatically.
One more question, then I'm going to bring you into the conversation. So get ready. If you have a question, please signal now, madly, and a microphone will come to you while you're doing that. Congresswoman Esty, you've been working on the diversification of the STEM workforce, specifically interested in girls, people of color. Tell us about that.
Well, it's become very clear as we look at, manufacturing's been one of my core interests, and my grandfather helped start a little manufacturing company that's still doing zinc die casting in Decorah, Iowa, always stayed in the United States. And actually my district is adjacent to John's, and I would say I understand the electorate to have been voting for change in 08 and in 12 and in 16, and they are continuing to vote for change. Mm-hmm. People want change, and they see a very disruptive world that's scary. And I'm not seeing the same kind of optimism you are. I suspect John is not seeing as much optimism either. People are feeling dislocated, and manufacturing is part of that. New England has 16,000 manufacturing positions unfilled right now. There's a skills mismatch, and frankly, the opioid crisis has hit a district like mine. It's hit the Northeast very hard, parts of the Midwest, people who are dislocated, disaffected, and despairing. And so we have got to, that's part of actually why we can't fill these positions. So I'm a big fan of the vocational technical schools, but we need to diversify that workforce. I went into United Technologies recently to see where they're building life support control systems for the International Space Station. And of the 43 engineers in one shop, 42 were white men over the age of 45. We cannot fill, we get clapping of all of you over, but we cannot fill those needs for the future workforce if we don't diversify that workforce. We just have to. And that has to be a collective effort. And so it does matter. It does matter. Thank you. So getting your help in doing that, and that's working with the unions, working with the trades are having the same issue, where our union brothers and sisters and everyone working in the trades, they're having the same problem. We're having much more diversified workforce in America, and we need to bring all that talent to the table. And we're going to have to do some things differently to do that.
Fantastic. So now we'd love to bring you into the conversation. We're going to start right here. And please, as yes, your question, just please say who you are and where you're from.
There was a very popular way of doing business before, and I know that the Congress really enjoyed doing it, both the House and the Senate.
Earmarks.
And it appears that everybody wants to do projects, be more transparent. When are earmarks going to come back? I mean, I know that the people that I know that are congressmen and senators, everyone loves earmarks. The only problem we had was the transparency wasn't there, and we had issues of bridge to nowhere. But now, I'm sure that I'd like to hear your comments on what you think about earmarks. We love earmarks, by the way.
The Rules Committee has been tasked with dealing with that. I sit on the Rules Committee, and we've had a very tough time dealing with that. In the Obama administration, I could go back home and talk to constituents and say, we're talking about an Article 1 congressionally directed spending responsibility. Who do you trust more to spend the money, President Obama or me? Folks say, oh, Rob, we got to get that earmark power back, got to trust you. Today, I ask that same question. Folks might say, I trust Donald Trump more than I trust you, Rob, to direct that money. The person who put in the bridge to nowhere defends it vigorously today as a much-needed public infrastructure project in their district. It goes back to that value proposition. If you give me this authority, am I going to use it to prop myself up and flush your dollars down the toilet, or am I going to use it to prioritize Corps of Engineers projects that are all getting funded at de minimis levels today when we need to focus on things where we can actually be transformative? There is not the enthusiasm in the electorate today to bring back earmarks or congressionally directed spending. You might have that enthusiasm here, but you don't have it there.
The bridge to nowhere helped us get the majority. And after that, we implemented changes, first of all, to make them transparent. These earmarks had to be online. People had to swear that they had no financial interest in it. There was an opportunity for people to vet them. Every earmark that I had was consistent with our regional plans. That was a mechanism that solved the problem. That got caught up with some other political objectives. I think people now recognize that there are powerful, positive ways to be able to have some congressionally directed spending, speaking to some of the things. I don't agree actually with much of what Rob was saying, but giving people more confidence that it does speak to local issues that they're focusing on. This would be a way of addressing it. And I do think that next Congress, regardless of who's in charge, you will see this reinstituted. What you're seeing now is people are finding ways to kind of get around it indirectly in some of the appropriations process to nobody's credit. But I think people recognize that it can be done, and go look at what we did when we reformed it. I think that's a perfectly valid way that will be acceptable.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Nancy Clanton, engineer in Colorado. And my question is, several of you were talking about P3s as an alternate for financing projects. And I also thought it was interesting, I'm not sure who said it, funding versus financing. I'd like for you to delve into that more, because once we go P3s, we essentially are giving away a right-of-way and losing control of the infrastructure. So I'm curious if you've thought about that. And one of my analogies has been, What if we were all forced to use BlackBerries for the next 10 years? In other words, we're signing huge contracts, 15, 25, 30 years with P3s. So I'd like for you to delve into that a little bit more and convince me that this is a viable alternative.
Well, one of the things that I think there are certain situations where a public-private partnership can work. Airports, I think, are a perfect example. I think the private sector runs airports around the world. U.S. airports are not exactly the model of efficiency, et cetera. And I do think that where you have revenue, parking, other concessions, that a private operator would like to purchase a long-term lease or actually buy outright, there are possibilities where that can occur, and it can be done successfully. But I don't think that this is any kind of panacea, nor is it suitable in many places in many parts of the country. Road and bridges, I tend to think that the Indiana Highway was maybe an exception. Mitch Daniels hit it right at the right time. I'm not sure those projects have been very successful since then, and some would argue the Indiana toll road has not been successful either. So I just think there are certain systems. Airports are one that I think, Australia, for instance, they did a lot of privatizations, but in Australia, the government owned many more functions than the government does here. For instance, the government owned all the power lines. In the United States, those are predominantly owned by private utilities. So the international experience is not entirely replicable, but I do think airports, in some instances, maybe water systems, can be done efficiently this way, but it's not a panacea by any means. It's just an option.
Yeah. And if I may say, the Transportation Committee actually had a working group on this in 2013 and released a study, and their estimate was 7 to 14% of infrastructure projects in the United States would be suitable for P3s. So I think John's point is right. It is in the mix, but it is by no means going to be the major change. It has a role, and some states are going to need to modify their rules if they're going to allow P3s. But anybody who thinks that's the silver bullet is wrong. It's just not. It's only suitable for certain kinds of projects, and in the mix, but that is not going to make a transformative difference.
You need to go into it with your eyes wide open. Yeah. What's happened in some of these cases, people have outsourced their ability to raise tolls. They were afraid to raise tolls, so this was a convenient way to do that, and they jumped at getting a cash infusion without looking at the long-term consequences. And you're right, if you're going to surrender the control of the right-of-way, or what happened in Chicago with their parking meters. I mean, that's nuts. You have to deal with it like it's a public utility. You go back and forth, you negotiate it, you have to have a revenue stream to be able to support it. You only have a small number of projects around the country that will support public-private partnership. They can be done, they have been successful, but not done. If they're not done right, you get burned. It goes back to having a comprehensive financing approach so that people aren't desperate and doing stupid things. And in that context, I think it can go forward.
Super quick, I wanted to touch, and then we'll come to you. Super quick, I wanted to touch on water investment, Woman Esty, or anybody.
Sure, we're looking at doing the water resources bill, and one of the things I think we have a real opportunity to do is use new technology. This is actually something that the Science Committee is looking to call for innovation and have something, and it's something actually our problem solvers group called for creation of something called like an ARPA H2O, is to have a dedicated fund that is looking at using new technology and new resources and new materials to help deal with the water infrastructure issues. So you take a place like Detroit, or you take actually Syracuse. My co-chair, John Katko, says Syracuse has wooden water pipes. Wooden, 100 years old. You look at Detroit, which has lost massive numbers of population, but still has water lines it's got to use. We should be using the best scientists from around the country to figure out, can you reline those much smaller, those water mains, so you can keep the flows and keep them safe. So there are real opportunities for us to do smart things, and I hope we're going to look at doing that in the Word of Bill, because we need to, especially for new technologies for these aging water systems like Flint and like Detroit and many places across the industrial Midwest and the Northeast.
We're getting the hook, but real quick before
You've worked with me on a water trust fund. We have legislation that would do that. One's voluntary and one would be mandatory to be able to establish that. If anybody wants to look at what we've worked on with you, it's available. Steve, we can get it in their hands.
As we say goodbye, Congresswoman Esty has a skill that I think is safe to say no one else in this room has. So we end Axios each day with one fun thing. So our one fun thing, Congresswoman Esty, you're going to Disneyland because why?
No, not Disneyland.
Well, if you win the Olympics, right?
Oh, if I were, no, the fun fact is I was recently curling. I have a curling sheet in my district, and my grandfather, the engineer, and the Scotsman was on the U.S. national curling team. And so I was recently in Norfolk, Connecticut, which has an awesome place to go curling. So if you're ever up in northwest Connecticut, come curling with me.
And you were actually pretty good.
I'm actually pretty good. Engineers would like it. It's much harder than it looks, and it looks ridiculous. You usually wind up on the ice. You like slide and then you have to turn. There's a whole turn thing you have to do. So if you're ever up in northwest Connecticut, let me know and we'll go curling.
We'd like to thank the American Council of Engineering Companies, our host. We'd like to thank these lawmakers, members of Congress, for their service and for this fascinating conversation. Thank you, and enjoy Earth Week and enjoy the swamp.